I'm Beverly, 32 years old, and I thought the worst betrayal would come from strangers. But when your own mother hands you divorce papers to forge, and your brother counts stolen money at the kitchen table, you realize family can be your biggest enemy. Right now, I'm sitting in the FBI field office in Denver, Colorado, having just filed a federal complaint against the two people who raised me. They tried to frame me for fraud, but I overheard their plan, gathered proof, and let the FBI finish the job. Before I tell you how my family tried to destroy me and how I brought them down, let me know where you're watching from and hit that like button. You won't believe what happens next when blood really isn't thicker than water. Let me start by telling you about my life before everything fell apart. I work as a paralegal at Morrison & Associates law firm here in Denver, Colorado. For 8 years, I've been handling real estate transactions, divorce papers, and estate planning. It's detailed work that requires precision and a deep understanding of legal procedures. I know authentic documents when I see them, and I can spot forgeries from a mile away. This expertise would later save my life. My family consists of my mother, Martha, who's 58, and my older brother, Dennis, who's 35. Our father, Gerald, passed away 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack, leaving behind our childhood home in Lakewood and a modest life insurance policy. The family dynamic had always been crystal clear. Dennis was the golden child, and I was the afterthought. From the moment Dennis was born, he could do no wrong in Martha's eyes. When he dropped out of college in his junior year to start his first business venture, she called it entrepreneurial spirit. When that business failed within 6 months, losing $15,000 of her retirement savings, she said he was gaining valuable experience. By the time he'd failed his fourth startup last year, I'd stopped keeping track of how much money she'd lent him. Dennis had this pattern that never seemed to change. He'd come up with what he called a revolutionary business idea. Convince Martha to invest thousands of dollars, then watch everything collapse within months. His latest obsession was cryptocurrency trading, which apparently meant losing $30,000 of Mom's savings in 2 weeks of reckless speculation. Meanwhile, I lived in a tiny studio apartment on Colfax Avenue, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic and eating ramen noodles for dinner most nights. Every spare dollar went into my savings account because I was determined to buy my own place someday. I watched Dennis cruise around in the BMW that Martha had co-signed for taking his girlfriends to expensive restaurants on her credit card, while I clipped coupons and shopped at thrift stores. The favoritism was so obvious that even our extended family noticed. During holiday gatherings, Martha would brag about Dennis's latest business venture, while barely mentioning my steady job and responsible lifestyle. When Dennis needed money, she'd write checks without hesitation. When I asked to borrow $200 for car repairs, she lectured me about fiscal responsibility and suggested I get a second job. 3 weeks ago, everything changed with a single phone call. I was at work reviewing contracts for a real estate closing when my phone rang. Martha's voice sounded strained and urgent, almost panicked. "Beverly, honey, I need you to come to the house right away. There's a family emergency." My stomach dropped. The last time she'd sounded this upset was when Dad had his heart attack. I immediately thought she'd received a cancer diagnosis or some other devastating news. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency and left work early, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios during the 20-minute drive to Lakewood. When I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home on West Alameda Avenue, Dennis's BMW was already there. That should have been my first warning sign. Dennis never visited during weekday afternoons unless he needed money or was in some kind of trouble. I used my key to let myself in, calling out as I entered the familiar living room. The house smelled like coffee and something else I couldn't identify. Tension, maybe. Fear. They were sitting at the dining room table, which was covered with manila folders, loose papers, and what appeared to be official documents from various companies. Martha looked up with red-rimmed eyes, and Dennis had this strange expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't his usual cocky confidence or his desperate neediness. It was something calculating and cold. "Beverly, thank God you're here," Martha said, standing to embrace me. Her hands were trembling slightly, and her hug felt different somehow, more desperate than affectionate. "What's wrong?" I asked, looking back and forth between them. "What's the emergency?" Dennis gestured toward the papers spread across the table. "We need your legal expertise for something important, something that could affect the whole family's future." Martha pulled out a chair for me at the dining room table, and I sat down reluctantly. The documents in front of me looked official at first glance, but something felt off about the whole situation. Why would they need my help with legal papers? Martha had handled all of Dad's estate planning through a proper attorney 3 years ago. "Your grandmother's estate has some complications we didn't know about," Martha began, sliding a thick folder toward me. "We just found out there are additional assets that need to be distributed, and we need someone with legal knowledge to review the paperwork." I opened the folder and immediately felt confused. My grandmother Rose had died 5 years ago, and I distinctly remembered attending the estate settlement with the rest of the family. Dad had handled everything through Jenkins Law here in Denver, and there hadn't been any complications or outstanding issues. The documents in front of me claimed to be recent probate filings related to property in Colorado Springs that supposedly belonged to Grandma Rose. But as I examined them more closely, my professional training kicked in. The letterhead looked slightly wrong. The fonts didn't match standard legal formatting. Most importantly, the signature on what was supposed to be Grandma's will looked nothing like her actual handwriting. "Mom, these documents don't look authentic," I said carefully, trying not to sound accusatory. "The formatting is inconsistent with standard probate procedures, and this signature doesn't match Grandma's handwriting. I've seen her Christmas cards every year for 30 years. Dennis leaned forward aggressively. "What do you mean, they don't look authentic? They came directly from the lawyer's office in Colorado Springs." "Which lawyer?" I asked, examining the letterhead again. "I've never heard of Patterson and Associates, and according to this address, they're located in Colorado Springs. But Grandma's original estate was handled by Jenkins Law here in Denver, and everything was settled 5 years ago." Martha's face flushed red and her voice became defensive. "Beverly, we just need you to review the paperwork and sign off on it. You're always so suspicious about everything. Can't you just trust your family for once?" That's when I noticed the real problem. Mixed in with the supposed estate documents were papers that had nothing to do with Grandma's property. There were business registration forms for something called Rose Memorial Investments bank account opening documents with Dennis's name on them, and asset transfer forms that would move significant amounts of money into new accounts. "These aren't estate documents," I said, standing up from the table. "These are forms to create new business entities and transfer money between accounts. What's really going on here?" Dennis's demeanor changed completely. The mask of concern dropped, and his voice became sharp and threatening. "Family helps family, Beverly. Dad always said we stick together no matter what happens." "Don't bring Dad into this," I snapped back. "He would never ask me to sign fraudulent documents, and he'd be disgusted if he knew what you were trying to do." The word fraudulent seemed to hit them like a physical blow. Martha went pale, and Dennis slammed his fist on the table hard enough to make all the papers jump. "You think you're so smart with your fancy legal job?" Dennis snarled. "But you've never helped this family when we actually needed you. Mom has invested everything she has in my businesses, and now we need to make some financial adjustments to protect our assets." "Protect them from what?" I demanded. "From creditors," Martha said quietly. "Dennis owes some people money, and they're starting to make threats. We need to move assets around so they can't be seized if things get ugly." The truth was finally starting to come out, and it was worse than I'd imagined. Dennis hadn't just failed at legitimate business ventures. He'd gotten involved with loan sharks and illegal gambling operations, and now he owed serious money to dangerous people. I gathered my purse and headed toward the front door. "I'm not signing anything until I understand exactly what's happening here, and I strongly suggest you both consult with a real attorney before you do something that could land you in federal prison." As I drove home, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. That night I spent hours researching online trying to verify the information they'd given me. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Grandma Rose had died exactly 5 years ago, just as I remembered. Her estate had been completely settled in 2019 through proper legal channels. There was no recent probate case, no complications, and definitely no additional assets to distribute. My family had just tried to involve me in document forgery, and I had no idea why they thought I would go along with it. But I was about to find out that this was just the beginning of their criminal enterprise. 3 days passed in uncomfortable silence before Martha called again. This time her voice was honey-sweet, the way it used to be when she wanted to manipulate Dad into buying something expensive. She invited me to a family dinner on Saturday night, claiming she wanted to apologize for the confusion and clear the air between us. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go. When I arrived at the house, Dennis was there with a woman I'd never met before. She looked young, maybe 25, with carefully styled blonde hair and designer clothes that definitely cost more than Dennis could afford on his non-existent income. "Beverly, this is Judith, my girlfriend," Dennis said, wrapping his arm around her waist possessively. "Judith, this is my sister, the one I told you about, the legal expert." Judith smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. There was something calculating about the way she looked at me, like she was sizing me up for something. "Dennis has told me so much about you. He says you're really talented with legal documentation and procedures." We sat down to dinner, and the conversation felt forced and artificial. Martha kept asking detailed questions about my job, pretending to be fascinated by cases I was working on. Dennis and Judith exchanged meaningful glances throughout the meal, like they were communicating in some kind of code. Something was definitely being planned, and I was clearly the target. After dessert, Martha brought out another folder of documents. "Beverly, I have a small favor to ask. One of Dennis's business associates needs help with some paperwork, and we thought you might be willing to review it as a family favor." The documents she handed me were divorce papers. Real divorce papers with official court formatting and proper legal language. But as I read through them carefully, I realized they were Dennis and Judith's divorce papers, despite the fact that they were sitting next to each other acting like a happy couple. "You two are getting divorced?" I asked, looking back and forth between them in confusion. "It's complicated," Judith said quickly, her voice smooth and practiced. "We need to file these papers for business and tax purposes, but we're staying together personally. It's a common financial strategy. Perfectly legal." It absolutely was not perfectly legal, and they knew it. I examined the financial disclosure sections and discovered a web of lies and fabricated information. The documents claimed Dennis had assets worth over $200,000, including ownership of the family home and several investment accounts that I knew didn't exist. "This is marriage fraud," I said flatly, setting the papers down on the table. "You're filing false financial information in a legal proceeding. This could result in federal charges for both of you." Dennis leaned forward, his voice becoming aggressive and threatening. "It's not fraud if nobody gets hurt, Beverly. We just need to move some assets around for legitimate tax and business purposes. Rich people do this kind of thing all the time." "Tax purposes?" I laughed bitterly. "Dennis, you haven't filed a tax return in 3 years because you don't have any legitimate income to report. What taxes are you trying to avoid?" That's when Martha decided to reveal their real motivation. "Beverly, your brother owes some very dangerous people a lot of money. We need to protect the family assets before they come looking for payment. These people don't care about legal procedures or family relationships. They just want their money, and they'll take it from whoever they can find." Finally, the truth started coming out in ugly, terrifying detail. Dennis hadn't just failed at legitimate business ventures. He'd gotten involved with underground gambling operations and had borrowed money from loan sharks to fund his cryptocurrency speculation. He now owed over $180,000 to people who collected debts with baseball bats and threats against family members. The divorce scheme was designed to protect family assets from Dennis's creditors. He and Judith, would get married on paper transfer ownership of all family property to Judith's name, then get divorced immediately. Judith would legally own everything, leaving Dennis with no assets that creditors could seize. After the heat died down, they would remarry and transfer everything back. "You're asking me to help you commit multiple felonies," I said, standing up from the table. "Marriage fraud, asset hiding, conspiracy to defraud creditors. And you're asking me to risk my professional license and my freedom to help Dennis avoid paying debts he legitimately owes to criminals." "We're asking you to help family," Martha said, her voice turning cold and threatening. "But I guess we know where your real loyalties lie. We know what's more important to you than your own blood relatives." As I headed toward the front door, Dennis called after me with barely controlled rage. "You're either with this family or against it, Beverly. Choose very carefully, because there won't be any second chances." I drove home that night knowing that my relationship with my mother and brother had fundamentally changed forever. They weren't asking for help anymore. They were demanding participation in criminal activity, and they'd made it clear what would happen if I refused to cooperate. But I had no idea how far they were willing to go to ensure my silence. The following Friday evening, I came home from work exhausted and looking forward to a quiet weekend. I'd been thinking all week about my family's demands, trying to figure out how to handle the situation without destroying relationships or enabling criminal behavior. As I unlocked my apartment door, I heard voices coming from inside my living room. My blood turned to ice as I recognized Martha's distinctive laugh echoing through my apartment. I pushed the door open slowly and found my mother and Dennis sitting comfortably on my couch, like they owned the place. Papers were spread across my coffee table, and they both looked up with satisfied expressions that made my stomach churn with dread. "Hello, sweetheart," Martha said sweetly. "We've been waiting for you to get home. We need to have a serious conversation about your future." "How did you get into my apartment?" I demanded, though I already suspected the answer. "Judith used to be your roommate 2 years ago, remember?" Dennis said with a smug smile. "She kept the spare key you gave her back then. We figured you wouldn't mind family stopping by to discuss important business." I looked at the papers scattered across my coffee table and felt the room start spinning around me. Bank statements with my name and account numbers, but showing large deposits I'd never made. Client files from my law firm that I'd never brought home. Legal documents with signatures that looked remarkably similar to my handwriting, but authorizing transactions I'd never approved. "What is all this?" I whispered, though part of me already understood what they'd done. Martha stood up and walked over to me, placing her hands on my shoulders, the way she used to do when I was a child and needed comfort. But there was nothing comforting about her touch now. It felt possessive and threatening. "Beverly, honey, we've been planning this conversation for several weeks now. You see, if you won't help us voluntarily, we'll have to find ways to encourage your cooperation through other means." Dennis picked up one of the fake bank statements and waved it in front of my face. "These documents show deposits totaling $43,000 into your personal checking account over the past 6 months. Money that corresponds exactly with funds that have gone missing from 3 different client trust accounts at your law firm." My hands started shaking as the full scope of their plan became clear. "Those statements are fabricated. I never stole money from any clients. I would never do something like that." "Of course they're fabricated," Dennis said casually, like he was discussing the weather. "But they look authentic enough to fool the Colorado State Bar Association and the Denver Police Department. We also have copies of client documents with your forged signature authorizing transfers of funds to offshore accounts that you supposedly control." Judith emerged from my bedroom, carrying a laptop computer I'd never seen before. "We also found this hidden under your bed, Beverly. It contains detailed records of your embezzlement scheme, including email communications with international banking contacts and spreadsheets tracking your illegal transactions." The laptop was obviously planted evidence, just like everything else they'd created. But I realized with growing horror that they'd constructed an entire false narrative of criminal activity that would be almost impossible for me to disprove quickly. By the time investigations were completed and I was eventually cleared, my career would be destroyed and my professional reputation would be ruined forever. "Here's exactly what's going to happen," Martha said, sitting back down and organizing the fabricated evidence into neat, threatening piles. "Monday morning, Dennis and I are going to file detailed complaints with the Colorado State Bar Association, the Denver Police Department, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We'll present all this evidence and explain how worried and heartbroken we are about our daughter's descent into criminal behavior. Unless," Dennis added with a cruel, triumphant smile, "you decide to become a team player and help us with our legitimate business arrangements. Sign the documents we need for our financial planning. Keep your mouth shut about our private family matters, and all this unpleasant evidence disappears forever." I stared at these two people who had raised me, who had celebrated my law school graduation, who had supposedly loved me unconditionally throughout my entire life. But I was looking at strangers now. These weren't family members asking for help. These were criminals threatening to destroy an innocent person to protect their illegal activities. "I need time to think about this," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "You have until Sunday evening to make your decision," Martha replied coldly. "That gives you the entire weekend to consider your options carefully. But Beverly, sweetheart, if you choose to fight us on this, you will lose everything. Your job, your professional license, your reputation, your freedom. Is protecting some abstract legal principle really worth destroying your entire future?" They gathered up their fabricated evidence and headed toward my front door. Dennis paused at the threshold and looked back at me with an expression of pure malice and satisfaction. "Oh, and Beverly, don't bother trying to contact anyone about this situation. Who's going to believe that your own mother and brother would frame you for embezzlement? Family doesn't betray family like that. Everyone knows how much we love you." After they left, I sat alone in my violated apartment trying to process what had just happened. They were absolutely right about one thing. If they filed those complaints on Monday morning, I would be arrested, suspended from my job, and facing years of expensive legal battles to prove my innocence. Even if I eventually cleared my name, the damage to my career and reputation would be permanent. But they were completely wrong about something else. I wasn't going to let them win. That weekend was the longest of my entire life. I couldn't stay in my apartment knowing they had access and might return to plant additional evidence or steal something else they could use against me. I called my coworker Janet and asked if I could stay at her house for a few days, claiming I was having maintenance issues with my plumbing. Saturday morning, I drove back to my building and spoke with my neighbor Phyllis, a retired teacher who spent most of her time watching the neighborhood from her front window. She confirmed that she'd seen my mother and brother entering my apartment Thursday evening with boxes and bags, then leaving several hours later with what appeared to be documents and files. Using the building maintenance key that Phyllis kept for emergencies, I managed to get back into my apartment. Everything looked exactly as my family had left it, which meant the planted evidence was probably still hidden somewhere. I spent 3 hours carefully searching and photographing every fake document they'd created, making sure to capture the poor quality of the forgeries and the obviously fabricated information. The fake bank statements were particularly amateur work. The account numbers were incorrect for my actual bank. The routing codes didn't match any legitimate financial institutions, and several of the deposit dates fell on weekends when electronic transfers aren't processed. Anyone with basic knowledge of banking procedures would immediately recognize them as clumsy forgeries. But I also understood that most people, including police investigators and state bar officials, might not notice those technical details during an initial complaint review. The fake evidence would be convincing enough to trigger a full investigation, and that investigation would destroy my life, even if it eventually proved my innocence. Sunday morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I researched recording apps for smartphones and practiced using the technology until I could activate it quickly and discreetly. If my family wanted to threaten me with fabricated evidence, I was going to get them on tape admitting to their criminal activities. I called Martha Sunday afternoon and told her I was ready to cooperate with their demands. My voice probably sounded defeated and frightened, which was exactly what she wanted to hear. We arranged to meet Monday evening at the family house to finalize all the paperwork and discuss the terms of my participation. "You're making the smart choice, Beverly," Martha said before hanging up. "Family always comes first, and we're going to take very good care of you." Monday evening, I drove to the house with my phone configured to record our entire conversation. My hands were trembling as I rang the doorbell, but my mind was completely focused on what I needed to accomplish. I had one opportunity to get them on tape confessing to their crimes, and I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Dennis answered the door with a triumphant, satisfied smile. "Look who finally decided to join the family business. I knew you'd come around eventually." I followed him into the living room where Martha and Judith were waiting with stacks of documents spread across the coffee table. The scene looked like a legitimate business meeting except for the fact that everyone present was planning to commit serious federal crimes. "Before we get started with the paperwork," I said, sitting down across from them, "I want to understand exactly what you're asking me to do. Walk me through the entire plan step by step so I know exactly what I'm getting involved with and what my responsibilities will be." That was all the encouragement Dennis needed to reveal everything. For the next hour and 15 minutes, Dennis, Martha, and Judith explained their criminal operation in explicit, incriminating detail. My phone recorded every word as they described a sophisticated fraud scheme that had been operating for almost 2 years. It had started with Dennis's gambling debts and cryptocurrency losses, but had evolved into something much larger and more systematic. They were running coordinated fraud operations targeting elderly victims across Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, using fake identities and forged documents to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars. "The secret is finding the right kind of victims," Judith explained, clearly proud of her expertise. "We look for elderly people who have significant assets, but no close family members to ask questions. Recent widows and widowers are perfect because they're emotionally vulnerable and desperate for human connection." Dennis spread out photographs and personal information about their current targets. "We research potential victims through obituaries and social media. When someone's spouse dies, we wait about 6 months for the grief to settle. Then Judith makes contact as a concerned neighbor or friendly volunteer." Martha described how they slowly built trust with victims over several months. "You can't rush these people. Judith befriends them, helps with small tasks like grocery shopping or doctor's appointments, and gradually becomes someone they depend on emotionally. Once they trust me completely," Judith continued, "I start mentioning financial problems or investment opportunities. I explain that I have connections who can help them protect their assets or earn better returns on their savings." The scheme involved creating fake business entities and investment funds, then convincing victims to transfer their money into accounts that Dennis and Martha controlled. They used forged legal documents to make everything appear legitimate, and they had developed sophisticated methods for laundering the stolen funds through multiple bank accounts. "We've made over $500,000 in the past 18 months, Dennis said proudly. "And we're just getting started. With Beverly's legal expertise, we could probably double our profits within 6 months." They showed me detailed victim files containing personal information, financial records, and documentation of money transfers. 8 different elderly people had been systematically defrauded with individual losses ranging from $30,000 to $120,000. The beauty of targeting elderly victims is that they often don't realize they've been robbed until it's too late, Martha explained. "By the time they figure out what happened, we've already moved the money through multiple accounts and the trail is impossible to follow." They had been planning to expand their operation to California and Arizona when I started asking uncomfortable questions about their paperwork. That's when they decided I was either going to become a willing participant or a dangerous liability that needed to be eliminated. "The problem with you, Beverly, is that you know too much about legal procedures and document authentication," Judith said. "We can't risk you figuring out what we're doing and reporting us to the authorities. So we decided to bring you into the business," Dennis added. With your legal knowledge and professional reputation, we could create much more sophisticated forgeries and target wealthier victims. As they continued explaining their operation, I kept asking follow-up questions to get them to provide even more incriminating details. They described how they researched victims, how they forged signatures on legal documents, how they laundered money through fake business accounts, and how they planned to expand into additional states. By the time our conversation ended, I had recorded detailed confessions to wire fraud, mail fraud, elder abuse, money laundering, conspiracy identity theft, and multiple other serious felonies. Everything was captured clearly on my phone with timestamps and GPS coordinates, proving exactly where and when the admissions were made. "So when do we start working on new targets?" I asked, pretending to be eager to join their criminal enterprise. "Tomorrow," Martha said excitedly. "We have a new victim in Boulder, an 84-year-old widow named Agnes, who just lost her husband 3 months ago. She owns a house worth $600,000 and has substantial savings. Judith's been cultivating the relationship for 5 weeks. She's perfect," Judith added. "No children, no close relatives, and she's already started asking me for advice about managing her finances. We should be able to get her to transfer at least $300,000 within the next month." I left the house that night with everything I needed to destroy them. But instead of going home, I drove directly to the FBI field office in downtown Denver. It was time to choose justice over family loyalty. Special Agent Harold Thompson reviewed my evidence for over 2 hours before speaking. The recording was crystal clear, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating. My family had confessed to federal crimes that could result in decades in prison. "Beverly, this is some of the strongest evidence I've encountered in 20 years of investigating financial crimes," Agent Thompson said, leaning back in his chair. "Your family has admitted to crimes across multiple state lines, which gives us clear federal jurisdiction. We can move very quickly on this case." But Agent Thompson wanted more than just my recording. He asked if I would be willing to wear a wire for one final meeting with my family, giving the FBI an opportunity to record them actually planning their next crime and handling physical evidence. "It's not without risk," he explained honestly. "If they discover the recording device, they could become violent or try to flee. And you should understand that once we arrest them, there's no going back. Your relationship with your family will be permanently destroyed." I considered that possibility for exactly 5 seconds. My family had already destroyed our relationship when they decided to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. They had made it crystal clear that they were willing to sacrifice my freedom and my future to protect their criminal operation. "Let's do it," I said without hesitation. Wednesday afternoon, I called Martha and told her how excited I was to get started with their business. I suggested we meet that evening to discuss the Boulder victim in detail and plan our approach for the money transfer. Martha was thrilled, telling me how proud she was that I'd finally decided to put family loyalty first. The FBI fitted me with a small recording device disguised as a button on my blouse. The technology was so sophisticated that it was completely undetectable even during close physical contact. Agent Thompson and 4 other agents would be positioned outside the house in unmarked vehicles, ready to move in as soon as they had sufficient evidence on tape. I arrived at the house that evening carrying a briefcase full of fake legal documents that the FBI had prepared as props. My assignment was to get my family to walk through their entire criminal process while the wire captured everything for federal court. Dennis, Martha, and Judith were in excellent spirits, celebrating what they believed was my conversion to their criminal lifestyle. They had purchased expensive champagne ordered takeout from an upscale restaurant and prepared detailed plans for defrauding the Boulder widow. "Beverly, you're going to love working with us," Dennis said enthusiastically, spreading photographs of the victim's house across the dining room table. "This woman has no children, no close relatives, and property worth more than $500,000. We're going to make so much money together." For the next 2 hours, they demonstrated their criminal methodology in extraordinary detail, while the FBI wire recorded everything. They showed me forged documents, fake business registrations, and bank account information for money laundering operations. Judith explained step by step how she manipulated elderly victims by pretending to be a trustworthy friend and advisor. The secret is making them believe you genuinely care about their welfare, Martha explained. You have to be patient and build real emotional connections. Only then will they trust you enough to sign documents transferring their life savings. They had victim files containing social security numbers, financial account information, copies of wills and estate documents, and detailed psychological profiles describing each person's emotional vulnerabilities and decision-making patterns. At exactly 9:15 p.m., Agent Thompson and his team executed their arrest warrants. I watched the color drain from my family's faces as federal agents knocked on the front door and identified themselves. FBI opened the door immediately. Dennis jumped up from the table, scattering evidence everywhere. Beverly, what did you do? What the hell did you do? Before I could answer, the front door burst open, and armed federal agents flooded into the living room. Agent Thompson held up his badge as his team moved efficiently to secure the scene and the suspects. Dennis Williams, Martha Williams, and Judith Patterson, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, mail fraud, and elder abuse. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Martha stared at me with an expression of absolute shock, betrayal, and disbelief. Tears were streaming down her face as the reality of the situation hit her. How could you do this to your own family? How could you destroy the people who love you? You stopped being my family the moment you decided to frame me for crimes I didn't commit, I replied calmly. As the agents handcuffed Dennis, he started screaming that everything was Judith's idea and that he'd been manipulated and coerced into participating. Judith immediately blamed everything on Martha and Dennis, claiming she'd been forced to help them against her will. Martha just kept staring at me with tears streaming down her face, unable to comprehend that her own daughter had orchestrated their downfall. The FBI seized boxes of evidence from the house, including victim files, financial records, forged documents, and detailed plans for targeting additional victims in 4 states. They discovered over $60,000 in cash hidden throughout the house, along with fake identification documents and sophisticated computer equipment used for creating fraudulent paperwork. Agent Thompson approached me as they prepared to transport my family to the federal detention center. Ms. Beverly, you should know that we've already contacted the victims in Colorado Springs, Grand Junction, and Albuquerque. Because of your cooperation and the evidence you provided, we'll be able to recover most of their stolen money and return it to them. As I watched my mother and brother being loaded into federal transport vehicles, I felt a strange combination of sadness, relief, and vindication. These people had raised me, taught me right from wrong, and claimed to love me unconditionally. But somewhere along the way, they had decided that money was more important than morality, and that family loyalty meant enabling criminal behavior. The next morning, every local news station covered the story of the family fraud ring that had been broken up by an FBI investigation. They described Dennis as the ringleader, Martha as a willing participant, and Judith as a career criminal with outstanding warrants in multiple states. My name was kept confidential as a cooperating witness, but everyone in our community knew exactly who had provided the evidence that brought them down. The federal court proceedings moved swiftly and decisively. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including my recorded confessions and the FBI's wire recordings from our final meeting, all 3 defendants chose to plead guilty rather than risk going to trial and receiving even harsher sentences. Dennis was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for his role as the primary conspirator and ringleader. The judge noted that his gambling addiction and financial desperation didn't excuse his decision to prey systematically on vulnerable elderly victims, and that his complete lack of remorse during the investigation suggested he would definitely reoffend if given the opportunity. Martha received 5 years in federal prison. Her attorney argued for leniency based on her age and her claim that Dennis had manipulated her into participating. However, the prosecution presented clear evidence that Martha had actively recruited victims, managed the money laundering operation, and helped develop the sophisticated techniques they used to gain victims' trust. Judith was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison after the FBI investigation revealed outstanding fraud charges in Texas, Arizona, and Nevada. She was apparently a career criminal who specialized in elder abuse schemes and had been operating similar frauds for over 15 years across the western United States. The financial impact of their crimes was staggering and heartbreaking. The FBI investigation ultimately revealed that they had stolen $847,000 from 11 different victims across 4 states. Some victims were able to recover their money through federal asset forfeiture proceedings, but others had lost their entire life savings and would never financially recover. I testified at all 3 sentencing hearings, explaining how my family had attempted to frame me for embezzlement when I refused to participate in their criminal operation. The federal judge commended me for choosing justice over family loyalty, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone who had been forced to choose between protecting innocent victims and protecting criminals who happened to share my genetic code. My professional life actually improved significantly after the investigation concluded. Morrison and Associates promoted me to senior paralegal with a substantial salary increase, recognizing that my cooperation with federal law enforcement had prevented their firm from being implicated in any criminal activity. My colleagues respected my difficult decision to report family members' crimes, understanding that I had protected the integrity of our entire profession. The Colorado State Bar Association sent me an official letter of commendation for upholding legal ethics under extremely challenging personal circumstances. They specifically noted that my refusal to participate in document forgery, despite intense family pressure and personal threats, exemplified the highest standards of professional conduct. But the emotional healing process took much longer and required professional help. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma and betrayal. Dr. Ellen helped me understand that my family's criminal behavior was absolutely not my fault, and that choosing to report them was the only morally acceptable option available to me. Your mother and brother put you in an impossible position, Dr. Ellen explained during one of our early sessions. They demanded that you choose between your personal integrity and their approval. That's not a choice that loving family members should ever force someone to make. Extended family members initially blamed me harshly for destroying the family unit. My Aunt Agnes called me a traitor and accused me of being jealous of Dennis's relationship with Martha. My cousin Joyce said I should have found a way to protect Dennis without involving law enforcement. But as more details about the scope and cruelty of their crimes became public knowledge, most relatives began to understand that I'd had no other choice. I used the financial reward money from the FBI's Victim Assistance Program to make a down payment on a small house in Wheat Ridge. For the first time in my adult life, I owned something that truly belonged to me, something that no one could take away or use as leverage against me. I also made the decision to enroll in law school part-time, with the ultimate goal of becoming a prosecutor specializing in financial crimes against elderly victims. My personal experience with fraud schemes had shown me how devastating these crimes could be for vulnerable people, and I wanted to dedicate my career to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Martha wrote me dozens of letters from federal prison alternately asking for forgiveness and expressing anger about my betrayal. She claimed that she had been manipulated by Dennis and Judith, and that she still loved me despite everything that had happened. She begged me to visit her and to help her appeal her sentence. I read every letter carefully, but I never responded to any of them. Dennis also wrote from prison, but his letters were filled with rage, self-pity, and blame. He accused me of destroying the family out of jealousy and spite. He claimed that I had always resented his relationship with Martha, and that reporting their crimes was my revenge for a lifetime of perceived slights and favoritism. He never once admitted guilt, or expressed any remorse for the elderly victims whose lives they had destroyed. I kept all those letters as a permanent reminder of who these people really were beneath their claims of family loyalty and love. The brother who wrote those angry, manipulative letters was the same person who had been willing to frame me for embezzlement. The mother who begged for forgiveness from prison was the same person who had planted fake evidence in my apartment and threatened to destroy my career. 2 years after their arrests, I encountered Judith's former cellmate at a coffee shop in downtown Denver. She told me that Judith had been bragging to other inmates about her sophisticated plan to manipulate a local family into helping with fraud schemes. Apparently, she had specifically targeted families with legal expertise, knowing that having an inside person would make their forgeries much more believable and their operation more profitable. That conversation helped me understand that my family hadn't just stumbled accidentally into criminal behavior. They had been deliberately recruited and trained by a career criminal who saw them as useful assets for her ongoing fraud operation. But that knowledge didn't excuse their choices or reduce their responsibility. Adults are accountable for their own decisions regardless of who influences or manipulates them. I eventually started dating Kenneth, who worked as a forensic accountant for a nonprofit organization that investigated financial crimes against elderly victims. Kenneth understood the importance of financial integrity and legal compliance, having spent his career ensuring that charitable donations were used appropriately and that vulnerable people were protected from exploitation. Kenneth never pressured me to forgive my family or maintain any contact with them. He understood that some relationships become too toxic and destructive for repair, and that cutting ties with harmful people is sometimes the healthiest choice available. His support helped me realize that real family should be defined by love, loyalty, respect, and shared values, not by genetics or legal obligations. 4 years after the arrests, Agent Thompson called to inform me that my family's case had been incorporated into FBI training programs for new agents studying financial crimes. The wire recordings and evidence I had gathered were being used to teach investigators how to build cases against sophisticated fraud operations that target vulnerable victims. Your courage in reporting your own family members has directly contributed to law enforcement training that will help protect thousands of future victims, Agent Thompson explained. You should be genuinely proud of the positive impact your decision has had on federal law enforcement. I was proud of that impact, but I was also deeply sad about the circumstances that had made it necessary. I was proud that my actions had helped protect innocent people from becoming victims of fraud. But I was heartbroken that my own mother and brother had been the criminals who needed to be stopped. Now, 6 years later, I'm about to graduate from law school and begin my career as a federal prosecutor specializing in crimes against elderly victims. I own my own home, maintain healthy relationships with people who respect my values and integrity, and work in a profession that allows me to protect vulnerable people from financial predators and exploitation. People sometimes ask me if I regret turning in my family members. The answer is always absolutely not. I regret that they chose to become criminals. I regret that they tried to frame me when I refused to join their criminal enterprise. I regret that they chose money over morality and crime over authentic family loyalty. But I don't regret choosing justice over blood relationships. I don't regret protecting innocent victims over protecting guilty relatives. And I definitely don't regret choosing the FBI over my mother, because my mother had already chosen crime over her daughter. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that family isn't defined by genetics or legal relationships. Real family consists of people who love you unconditionally, support your moral choices, encourage your personal growth, and would never ask you to compromise your integrity for their benefit. Blood doesn't automatically make family. Loyalty, respect, genuine love, and shared values do. And sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are actually the ones you most need protection from. I chose the FBI over my mother because my mother chose crime over her daughter. And if I faced the same choice again tomorrow, I would make exactly the same decision without a moment's hesitation. Have you ever been forced to choose between family loyalty and doing what's morally right? How did you handle a situation where the people closest to you asked you to compromise your values? I'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or helped you think about difficult family relationships, please give it a like and subscribe for more true stories about overcoming betrayal and finding justice in impossible situations. Share this video with anyone who might be facing similar choices about toxic family dynamics or ethical dilemmas. Remember that choosing your personal integrity over family approval is never the wrong decision, even when it's the most difficult decision you'll ever have to make. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it gives you the courage to do what's right even when the people you love are doing what's wrong.